High above the clouds at 30,000 feet, a loud executive slammed his hand on the armrest and pointed straight at me. "Look at your cheap clothes. You don't belong in first class. Give up your seat for my colleague. I'm a VIP and I practically own this airline." The entire cabin went still. Every passenger stared into their champagne or their window, anywhere but at us. He had no idea that the quiet woman in the simple sweater sitting right beside us, the one who had been reading a worn paperback for the past 2 hours, who had smiled when my daughter dropped her crayon, who ordered plain tea instead of wine, was the actual chairwoman of the entire airline. And she was about to show him what real power sounds like when it stays completely silent. It started the way most humiliations do. Quietly, with a look. I was buckled into seat 3A on the overnight flight from New York to London when the flight attendant leaned down and told me, almost apologetically, that the economy cabin had been oversold. Due to a system error, Millie and I had been upgraded to first class at no charge. She said it like she was delivering good news. I thanked her. I didn't feel the way she expected me to feel. Millie was 6 years old and had been awake since 4 in the morning because her fever had finally broken around 3, and neither of us had slept more than an hour. She was clutching her stuffed white rabbit, the one she'd named Cloud, with both arms, her head heavy against my shoulder as I guided her down the narrow aisle toward seats I had never paid for and probably never would. I was wearing my old canvas jacket, the one with the fraying left cuff I kept meaning to fix. My eyes were the color of someone who had spent the last 4 nights on a hospital waiting room chair. I hadn't shaved since Tuesday. I looked, I imagine, exactly like what I was. A father running on nothing but coffee and necessity, doing his level best to hold the world together for a child who didn't yet know how fragile it was. First class smelled like leather and warm bread. The seats were wider than some rooms I'd lived in. A flight attendant offered us champagne before we even sat down. I asked for water. Millie asked if the seats could go flat like a bed. The attendant smiled and showed her how. That was when I noticed him. Sterling, I would learn his name later from the way he barked it at the crew, was seated 2 rows ahead, already reclined, already on his second drink. He wore a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, and the expression of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. He looked back at us the moment we sat down, the way a person looks when something has appeared in their space without permission. He said nothing yet. He just looked. I tucked Cloud under Millie's arm, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and positioned myself between her and whatever was coming. I had learned, over 6 years of doing this alone, that the most important thing a father can do is make sure his child never sees him flinch. I did not flinch. She was already seated when we arrived, window seat 3C, and she did not look up when we settled in beside her. She was reading a paperback with a creased spine, the kind of book that had been read before, maybe more than once. She wore a simple gray sweater, a wool scarf looped loosely around her neck, and no jewelry that I could see. Her hair was silver at the temples. She looked like a woman in her mid-60s who was accustomed to being comfortable in her own silence. I noticed her the way you notice someone who does not demand to be noticed, which is to say, slowly, and with a growing sense that there was more there than the surface suggested. For the first 2 hours of the flight, as the cabin dimmed and most passengers drifted toward sleep or screens, she read. Occasionally she would glance over, not intrusively, not with the loaded stare that Sterling had aimed at us, but with the calm attention of someone piecing together a story from small details. She watched me ask for a second glass of water. She watched me cut Millie's bread roll into small pieces without being asked. She watched me show Millie how to yawn to pop her ears when the pressure changed, demonstrating it myself first so the child wouldn't feel embarrassed. Then Millie dropped her crayon. It rolled under the seat and came to rest near the woman's foot. Before I could reach across, the woman had already bent down, retrieved it, and held it out to my daughter with a small, unhurried smile. Millie whispered, "Thank you." Then, because she was 6 and had not yet learned to be cautious around strangers, she studied the woman's face for a moment and said, "My daddy says people who read books on airplanes usually have a very beautiful world inside their head." The woman looked at me. I opened my mouth to apologize for my daughter's candor. She spoke first. "Your daddy sounds like someone worth listening to." That was how it began. A conversation that unfolded the way conversations do when neither party has an agenda, in fragments, between the soft interruptions of a half-sleeping child. She asked where we were headed. I told her London, then home to Bristol, to my mother's house where Millie could recover somewhere warm. She asked what had kept us in New York. I told her the truth. Millie had been sick, a hospital stay longer than expected, and we were finally going home. She listened the way few people listen, without preparing her response while I was still speaking. I asked about her. She said she worked in aviation. She said it the way people say things when they are technically telling the truth and choosing not to elaborate. I did not press her. I had no reason to. I did not know she was Ilara Voss, founder and chairwoman of the airline we were flying on. I treated her the way I try to treat everyone, like someone whose story I don't yet know and whose time is worth as much as my own. That, I think, is what she noticed. It happened somewhere over the Atlantic, in the quiet dark between midnight and whatever comes after. Millie had finally fallen asleep, Cloud tucked under one arm, the seat reclined to its full flat position. I had draped my jacket over her because the cabin temperature had dropped, and I didn't want to wake her by reaching for the overhead storage. I was cold, and I didn't care. Sterling had been on his phone, in violation of the flight rules, though no one had said so, and the call had not gone well. I could tell by the way his jaw had tightened, the way he'd set his glass down too hard. When a man like that receives bad news, he does not absorb it. He redistributes it. He called the senior flight attendant over. I heard everything. The cabin was quiet enough that I suspect most passengers heard, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. He wanted to bring a business associate up from business class. He wanted him in first class. He had identified 2 seats he felt were being, in his words, wasted. He said this without looking at me, in the way powerful people sometimes discuss objects while those objects are present. The attendant, young, professional, visibly uncomfortable, explained that both seats were legitimately occupied following an authorized upgrade. She apologized. She used the word policy. Sterling used a different word for policy. Then he stood up. He walked to our row and stopped beside my seat. He was a large man, made larger by the certainty that he would not be challenged. He looked down at Millie, asleep, small, entirely unaware, and then at me, and then he reached into his jacket and produced a folded stack of $100 bills, which he set on my tray table with the deliberate care of a man making a point. "Enough for 2 proper economy tickets on your next flight," he said. "Take it. Take the child. Go back to where you were booked." No one in the cabin moved. No one spoke. I felt the attention of 20 people choosing all at once to look away. I looked at the money. I looked at my daughter sleeping. I looked at the man standing over us with the absolute conviction that everything in this world had a price, and he knew all of them. Then I picked up the bills, leaned across, and placed them on his empty seat. "My daughter is asleep," I said. My voice was level. I had practiced level in harder rooms than this. "We have a valid boarding pass. She hasn't disturbed anyone. I am asking you to return to your seat." He didn't move. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a black card, matte, metal, the kind that exists to communicate a specific message, and held it up between two fingers. "Platinum Diamond member," he said. 17 years. I practically own this airline." He reached toward me. The book closed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a clean, quiet snap. The sound of a decision being made. Ilara Voss set her paperback on the tray table, smoothed the cover once with her palm, and stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice or adjust her expression, or perform the moment in any way. She simply stood, and the quality of the air around her changed. The way it changes when something that has been very still for a very long time finally decides to move. Sterling turned toward her, ready to dismiss whoever was about to involve themselves. He did not dismiss her. "You don't own this airline," she said. Her voice was the same voice that had told my daughter she sounded like someone worth listening to. It had not changed in volume or temperature, but it carried something now that it had kept tucked away during the hours of polite conversation. A weight that didn't need to announce itself, because it had nowhere left to go but down. Sterling blinked. It was the first uncertain thing I had seen him do. "I'm sorry. And you are?" She turned to the senior flight attendant and addressed her by her first name, not as an assertion of familiarity, but as a simple statement of knowledge. She asked quietly for the crew tablet. The attendant brought it in under 20 seconds. Ilara Voss turned the screen so Sterling could see it. On it was an internal crew manifest, and at the top in the reserved field marked Special Passengers was her name, her title, and a photograph that left no room for interpretation. "My name is Ilara Voss," she said. "I founded this airline 26 years ago. I have been chairwoman of the board for the past 19. This aircraft, this route, and the employment of every person on this flight operates under my oversight." She paused, not for effect, but because she was someone who did not waste words and was choosing the next ones carefully. "You were correct about one thing. This airline does maintain the right to restrict future travel for any passenger who engages in conduct that violates our safety and dignity standards." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Your Platinum Diamond membership will be suspended pending a full review. Security will be notified to meet this flight at Heathrow. I would recommend you use the remaining flight time to consider the difference between influence and ownership. They are not the same thing, and tonight you've confused the two in a way that has consequences." Sterling sat down, not with defiance, not with the performance of a man accepting defeat on his own terms. He simply deflated. The expensive suit looked different on him now, as though it had never quite been his to begin with. Ilara Voss waited until he had settled, then turned away from him with the finality of someone closing a chapter they have no further interest in. She looked at me. The steel was gone from her expression, or rather, it had returned to wherever she kept it, somewhere internal and very well organized. What remained was the same quiet attention she'd shown all evening, the look of someone who sees clearly and judges slowly. "I'm sorry you experienced that," she said, "and I'm sorry it took longer than it should have to be addressed." Her eyes moved to Millie, still asleep, still holding Cloud. "She didn't wake up." "No," I said. "She didn't." Something moved across Ilara Voss's face that I couldn't name precisely. Respect, maybe, or recognition, the kind that passes between people who have both learned, through different roads and different costs, that the most important thing is to keep going without letting the hardness show. "You're a good father," she said. She sat back down, picked up her book, and found her page. We landed at Heathrow just before 5 in the morning, when the terminal was still gray and half awake, and the cleaning crews outnumbered the passengers at the gates. 2 men in security uniforms were waiting at the jet bridge. They were professional and quiet about it. Sterling walked between them without a word, his carry-on wheeled behind, his platinum diamond card presumably somewhere in the process of becoming ordinary plastic. None of the other passengers said anything. A few watched. Most looked away, which is the same thing we had all done earlier, and perhaps felt different about now. Millie woke up as we taxied to the gate, disoriented and warm-cheeked, asking if we were home yet. I told her almost. She asked if we could get a hot chocolate before the train. I told her absolutely. Ilara Voss declined the private car that was waiting for her. I saw the driver's slight surprise, quickly corrected into professionalism, and walked with us through the terminal instead. Not as a gesture, not as an extension of whatever the night had been. She walked with us the way people walk together when they are both simply going in the same direction and have no reason to pretend otherwise. Millie held 2 of her fingers. Children do that, bypass every layer of complexity and go straight to the thing underneath. Ilara Voss looked down at the small hand wrapped around her fingers, and she did not pull away. She adjusted her pace to match Millie's. We stopped at the first coffee kiosk past customs. I bought Millie her hot chocolate. I bought Ilara Voss a tea without asking, because I had watched her order it 3 times overnight, and it seemed like a reasonable thing to know about a person. She accepted it with the particular grace of someone who is not used to small gestures, and has therefore never learned to take them for granted. We stood there in the early morning gray. A tired father, a sleepy child, a woman who could buy the building we were standing in. And we drank our drinks in comfortable silence. "Safe travels home," she said when it was time. "You too," I said. Millie waved until Ilara Voss disappeared through a side door marked Staff and Crew, and then tugged my sleeve and asked if Cloud could have some of her hot chocolate. I told her Cloud was very lucky to have her. We took the train home. You know, my friend, this story is an original piece of fiction written from an honest place. The characters are imagined, but what they carry is real. The specific exhaustion of a parent trying to protect a child from a world that doesn't always make room for them. The invisibility of quiet competence in a room full of loud certainty. The moment when dignity, patient and unhurried, finally speaks. Here is the only truth this story is trying to tell. The size of someone's voice in a room tells you very little about the size of their actual authority. Real power does not need to announce itself. It waits. It watches. And when it finally moves, it does not need to shout, because it never needed anyone's permission to begin with. A black card cannot purchase character. 17 years of loyalty cannot license cruelty. What stays with us, what we carry home, is how we chose to treat people when we had every reason to look away. Thank you for spending this time here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to know in the comments. I'll be back next week with another. Quiet kindness always finds its way home.